Metropolitan Police. My cousin is a Louisville Metropolitan Police officer. I'm from one of the largest families in Louisville. My heart's still there. So we had some very nuanced, very complicated things that we were talking about. And from the conversations I was having across the United States, we decided that we were going to take an anti-racist stance and talk about what that meant in teacher education. So usually we go over, we do an overview of teacher practice with our candidates, and we define teacher practice as planning the enactment of a learning episode, the interpretation and translation of student outcomes for future learning and teaching. And then we discuss principles of anti-racist teaching practice and what that looks like in the moment. We take a practice stance with this work. Um, and the reason why I say a practice stance, you're going to find a variety of anti-racist work going on right now. And the conceptual frameworks that folks use are particular to the problems that they're trying to solve. Fullerton is trying to create teachers who can be effective for all students, specifically the most underserved in our community, which happens to be African American and Latinx children. So our unit of analysis is in the classroom, and that's where this anti-racist teaching practice takes place. So I want to make that very clear that this is about the skills and knowledge and understanding about our candidates and how we train them to be effective teachers in the classroom. The purpose of teaching is to apply the values, social cultural principles, and technical aspects of teaching to the specific needs of restoring the eldership function to the teaching profession. And the reason why I use eldership here is because many of our candidates, many of you may be in teacher education, making candidates. Many of our candidates come into our coursework and expect to be friends with the kids. We don't play that. You're the adults. The kids are there to learn from you. They got friends. You don't need to be one of them. But we need to introduce something to replace that because they're coming from a student mindedness. And we're trying to translate and transfer them to a teacher mindedness. So the eldership function works culturally amongst everybody, right? Because we're all Homo sapiens. And we start to facilitate discussions of teachers as trustworthy content experts whose integrity and intentionality of practice facilitates the psychological healing, restoration, and epistemic agency of historically oppressed people, right? It's a mouthful. And you may be asking, what do you mean by epistemic agency? Well, epistemic agency, as I am defining it, and I have a book here so that I can get it right. This is what epistemic agency is. This is out of rethinking field experiences and pre-service teacher preparation. I'm reading from what chapter am I? I'm 7, so I'm reading from 6 in this one. And it says here that in context, epistemic agency, and I'm adding that here, is the pedagogical practices that engage students in the discourse, documentation, and notation, knowledge production, representation, and application, and argumentation, critique, and interpretation commonly practiced in the discipline as a way to construct deep knowledge of the subject matter. So, in other words, if I walk into a classroom and a teacher is teaching social science, I expect to see a bunch of little historians walking around. Or I'm a cell molecular biologist by trade. So when you walked into my biology lab, you saw a whole bunch of freshmen using microscopes, formulating hypotheses, collecting data, organizing it, and formulating arguments. You didn't see a whole lot of worksheets. You didn't see a whole lot of close activity and fill in the blanks and those kinds of things. We negotiated expository text. We did a little engineering design. Those were the pedagogical choices I made for Black and Brown children, because that's what I taught my whole 9 through 12 career for 14 years. And my students were at failing high schools. But because I took an epistemic agency approach, I could consistently get high outcomes from Brown and Black kids that could outperform the state in biology at failing high schools, right? So there's nothing wrong with the kids. I just want to make that a philosophical stance right now. There's nothing wrong with the children, regardless if they speak multiple languages, regardless if they don't have any text at home or their parents didn't go to college or what have you. If you teach correctly, they'll perform. Okay, so here's some definitions. Anti-racist teaching practice comes from Dr. Ibram Kendi's work and from Dr. Ed Hollins's definition of teacher practice. And we've integrated these two concepts. So using these two things as a guide, what it means to be an anti-racist teacher is one who plans for, enacts, interprets, and translates student learning outcomes that reliably produce epistemic, intellectual, and creative agency that empowers students to pursue the professional endeavors of their choosing. You may ask yourself, why the professional endeavors of their choosing? Everybody's talking about closing the achievement gaps, right? Why not say to empower the students so that you can close the achievement gap? Well, according to the NAEP data, none of our kids are 50% proficient in any subject, in any demographic. So everybody is gapped, right? So even our white boys and girls are only 36% proficient in math. Everybody is underperforming. So I can't compare groups who are both suffering. The math scores for our Asian students only like 42% proficient. So I'm not kidding myself. We're under teaching and underserving all the kids, not just Black and Brown kids. So I want to raise everybody up so that they can pursue the professional endeavors of their choosing. And I'm going to focus on the lowest of the low. Because in disenfranchising Black and Brown kids, we've inadvertently hurt Asian and white children in the process. And I want to make that very clear. So I'm not here to sugarcoat anything, as you can see. Anti-racist pedagogy. This is a concept a lot of people grapple with this. I took the definition of pedagogy from Dr. Peter Morell's work. As you see, I live at my desk at home. Um, Peter Morell and his African-centered pedagogy book. He says pedagogy is a system of practices that includes socially, culturally, and historically grounded reflection. And once again, I add in that teacher practice on planning and enactment, interpretation, and translation. But these practices are used to intentionally empower children to define themselves as capable and epistemologically literate human beings. So I'm always tying back to agency of the students. I'm always anchored in teacher practice. And these are some of the principles that are guiding the talk today. Last but not least, I'm setting you guys up. Last but not least, we have here, once you give them pedagogy and practice, I think the next major important thing to make a healthy classroom is to empower our candidates to be able to vet curriculum to see if it will do no harm to children. So some colleagues of mine, Allison Dover and Nick Henning, worked with a teacher, I believe, uh, in creating this book. This is an actual book. And in it, they give you a checklist of questions that a candidate is supposed to ask themselves, or a teacher can ask themselves about curricular material. Like, is it truthful? Is it content heavy? Is it critical? Problem posing? Humanizing, right? Does it clearly and unapologetically call out racism and support the personnel and academic development of African American Latinx children? Does it address one or more of the four I's? The I's being ideology, institution, interpersonal, and internalized oppression. So those are the four I's of oppression. Does it address some of those things in a systematic way? Internalized and interpersonal racism is attended to and replaced with healing processes. And that's where you go to students' historical and cultural and social funds of knowledge. So, myself being African American, but I'm from the American South, I turn to folks who have regional understandings of what children need um, in our communities and tap into the community's ways of knowing and being so that students feel at home in the classroom. And we'll talk about that a little later. And then we purposely undermine, expose, and disprove white supremacy. Because, like I said before, white supremacy ain't doing nothing for the white kids. They can't read or write anyway. You know what I mean? Like, you're doing all this funny business. It's like the COVID outbreak. You did all this work and still people are dying. So I don't really care about how you feel about it. People are dying anyway. So we got to get our priorities straight when it comes to how do we protect, our kids. So we give them these tools. We define practice. We give them these tools. We give them opportunities to work with the tools, ask questions and focused inquiry, uh, have them do directed observations via video. So we've got um, a college-wide access to the Atlas videos. And the Atlas videos it's a repository of National Board videos of successful teachers. So we practice having them pinpoint areas where this material and these experiences are happening. And if they're not happening, we have a conversation about that. So um, it's super important to have, in doing this work with candidates, it's really important to have a theory of learning teaching. And our theory of learning teaching is based in three pillars. Like I said, focused inquiry into certain areas of teaching. And these things are always revisited. And those areas are things like curriculum, philosophy, teaching practice, facilitating student learning, epistemic practices. Those are some of the key cohesive concepts that run across the program. And so we engaged in developmentally appropriate focused inquiry into that. Then we have them do directed observations where we guide them to attend to certain nuances depending on what we are having them attend to. So, in a course that I'm teaching and that I'm the PDC director of, we're having them look at how teachers use assessment, how teachers get to know their kids and create student profiles and class profiles that are healthy, how to create a healthy classroom. Right now, we're in the moment pedagogy and focusing on how to be anti-racist in your in the moment pedagogy. And then we're going to be doing some reflection. So those are the five rotations, if you will. And each one of those rotations has a focused inquiry, a directed observation. And if they're teaching or in field work right now, a guided participation. So that's our philosophy or perspective of learning teaching, if that makes sense, right? And I think that's super important that programs articulate that so that the learning can be cohesive across the program and you can embed these things and integrate these things across it instead of tacking it on at the end or tacking it on in your diversity class. It becomes a thread throughout your program. Any questions?
Um, I have a question. It's
Yes, ma'am.
you addressing distance learning right now and
Mm-hmm.
lack of opportunities to really engage with real children.
Right, right.
And so, if you could just talk about that, and then how
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 did
are
we
we all
address that?
preparing to meet uh, children who've been underserved in
Hmm.
distance ed, and how do we prepare as our candidates to um, serve this group of children that was probably underserved before and is
Right.
now just floundering?
Absolutely. I would believe the first thing we need to do is develop these kind of intimate relationships with the schools the kids are in and the communities that are serving them, right? So in my own community, someone was like, "Oh, it looks like you guys in Fullerton are having a great time," and I'm like, "No, actually, I'm in the LAX area, so I'm only 13 minutes from the school that I used to teach at." At Washington. And so I know that community well. If I was a student teacher distance learning in that community, I would definitely ask what kinds of supports is the community offering and is the school offering. Right now, hotspots are a big issue in electronics. One of my former students was like, there's a backlog at Best Buy, even. Parents are trying to get anything for their kids. So definitely figure out what the technological issues are. Um, the biggest issue is students feeling alienated uh, from their peers right now because they can't interact. Um, find out if there's anything in the community through the churches or uh, social service kind of outlets. Counselors may know about some resources where students can get together and it not be academic so they can, get together and bond. And I'm observing that in my own household right now. They're bonding around Minecraft and anime. So get into whatever the kids are into and create some safe spaces around that. Be very sensitive about kids. Kids do not want to put their um, cameras on. They don't want to turn the cameras on. So I would tell my candidates to make a classroom ritual distance wise to at least turn your camera on once in the course so I can see your face so we can have that human to human interaction. It could be a do now, a warm up, a game, an exit ticket, something. And use your classroom routines so that you can make that human contact and incorporate games, uh, kind of like a social corner. And when you ain't seen your kids in a minute, you want to work with the school um, in reaching out to families and um, using multimodal ways of communicating, whether it's snail mail, sending a note home. I'm sure is still very effective, especially now with all the text messages and stuff. If there's a kid that you think is critical and needs to have this routine, even though it's virtual distance learning, a handwritten note home will probably be very effective. Just that real human contact. Phone calls home are good. All the good practices that we used to do, but be sensitive to the fact. Uh, I figure the same tactics we had with our homeless and foster care population, now all our kids are school homeless in a way. We're kind of fostering all the kids now. And so all of those good practices that we use to include the kids who are truant a lot and who are having a hard time, now it's the whole population. So I'm just naming things that we would do for our foster care and
Thank
homeless population kids.
thank you, Antoinette. We have a comment in the chat.
Hmm.
It seems like in some districts, cameras are required. In other districts, I know locally up here in Northern California, we've had a lot of debate around young people being uncomfortable with cameras on for
Hmm.
a variety of reasons. It's someone in the chat said that they're required in their local district. So um,
Okay.
maybe you can just speak to that.
Down in the South Bay, it's um, optional. So in Southern California. So uh, one of my candidates recently said, because they need to do the Cal TPA, and the Cal TPA has its own requirements for getting a license, right? So they brought up the fact that the kids aren't required to turn on their cameras. So one of my candidates was like, for this teaching episode, I'm asking you if you can please turn on your camera. So it's up in the air. Some kids didn't, but I guess enough kids did for him to record. Um, so for us, it's if they can't get recordings with children's faces, they've been advised to wait to take the Cal TPA when they get hired in induction.
Thank you.
How do we
We have,
encourage our colleagues in higher ed to be willing
yeah,
to adapt their curriculum pedagogy to more directly model? Ooh, that's a good question.
yeah. I was going to read that to you. A long question, but
That's
very
a good
valuable.
question.
Mhm.
Well, interestingly enough, I'm doing this work right now with my own colleagues. And a lot of, I have some very, all my colleagues are super qualified and super smart. They run from lukewarm to gun ho about this stuff, right? And it's actually a reflection of our political community right now, right? Because you've got our gun ho folks, you know, paving the way, and our lukewarm folks are like, yes, I can get on board, but I don't want to be called racist. I don't want to be assumed that I'm racist. I got my own problems. Can anybody talk about that? That this white privilege seems not to be working through. Um, I've got some folks who have to remind everybody that they're people of color, even though, there's folks around there who are like, she's just a white girl. And she's like, no, my father's black. My father's a black Cuban, right? So it's one of those things where we're making a lot of assumptions. I come from a PD background. So what I've done, and with some of my colleagues that I'm working with, is I did it wrong first, and then we steered in a good direction. The first thing I did was I made a tool for a college-wide activity we did, and the tool wasn't quite on point. It wasn't quite useful, and I didn't see that as a problem. I saw it as an opportunity to get people to say, well, why did you use this? Why not use this? And I could say, I didn't know about that. Tell us about it. So I could get the funds of knowledge from the faculty. It didn't work. Crickets. So I was like, hold up. Half of you do this work and y'all ain't got no comments on the tool that I just made, even though I'm saying shred it, rip it a new one. And they were like, we're not. So we said, okay. We took a step back and we did a Padlet that prompted them to share something that represented what they valued. And it could be a citation, it could be a quote, it could be a picture, it could be a song, it could be anything, right? And so we put up the Padlet and people explained why they put that up. The goal was to understand what the values of the department was so that we could mold the work around our collective values. So we've got the Padlet up, we talked about that. And then yesterday, we were in the meeting and we talked about what our positionalities were. And that was really a great space. And so next month, I plan to get folks together. Now that we've got our values and positionality, I'm going to have them make elevator pitches. Like, where do you see the department in this work in 5 years? And as they're talking about that. Now make a 30-second elevator pitch. The goal of that work is to create these pitches, and we talk about the pitches and say, what are our principles here? And as we embed and review and adapt and revise curricula, we're going to tie back to those elevator pitches to see if what we're doing in the courses are aligned to what we value. Next year, notice I said next year, because I expect that work to take all second semester. It takes 2 years to do this kind of work. Next year, we're going to take the values, the TPEs, and teacher practice, right? And we're going to create, I'm a science person, so I'm an NGSS person, next generation science. The next generation science performance expectations are made of 3 domains: practice, science and engineering practice, discipline core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts. I've interpreted those 3 in teacher ed to be teacher practice, the TPEs, and whatever the common values are, whatever the agency values are in the department. And so we got to get that work into integrating them, like the NGSS integrated those 3 domains. We got to get into the work of integrating our domains. And then we have to do a program map to see where these performance expectations that we're creating for our program are actually, hit on, and where the gaps are. And then at the end of the second year, we could talk about what learning experiences that we can create to fill in those gaps. But the core of this depends on us as a collective, as a profession, looking at teacher development as a developmental trajectory across time, starting in undergrad, going all the way to their 5th year in the classroom. If we keep looking at that year and a half or 2 years, after they get their degree, but before induction, if we think that we're going to create really good teachers in that small of a window, and we're not reaching out to our community college partners who have them before that, and we're not reaching out to the school districts who induct them, and we're not reaching out to the professional development folks who still, develop teachers, we don't look at this thing as a developmental trajectory, we're going to keep having these problems, right? They need to be learning teaching from the time they decide to become a teacher until their 5th year in the classroom. They need to be learning teaching. So I like this summit a lot. This summit needs to be bigger on this issue because there's a lot of players. There's the CCTE, there's the CTC, there's the Department of Ed. We've got a lot of conversations to have around this if we're really serious about doing this work. But to answer your question, that takes about 2 years to do. You're going to have a professional development model, and you're going to have to be able to elicit the values of your faculty first. That's what I learned from my experience. And then have very structured experiences using those values and you also have to map out your program. You have to have a program map. You got to see where experiences are and where those values, those TPEs and teacher practice come to play. So those are like the 3 things that need to happen. And you need 2 years to do it. Yeah. I wanted to do a little activity, but I don't think I have any. I don't think that I will have time. But erasing history for racist reasons is. Um, let me see if it goes. If you could hear it.
There's a very specific and messed up reason that has nothing
Can
to
you
do
hear
with
this?
history. The South is actually full of heroes who didn't support slavery, but you'd never guess that by looking at our statues. I can name 100 before I even get to Dolly Parton. And buddy, you better believe I'm going to get to Dolly Parton. She wrote Jolene and I Will Always Love You on the same day That's a hell of a lot more impressive than getting your handed to you at Gettysburg.
So I don't know why we don't build statues of her instead of Robert E. Lee.
Also, they'd be way better looking statues.
We need statues, not just like Dolly Parton. We need a lot of statues to combat them. Like, let's beat them with volume too. You know what I mean?
Right. So you mean not just like Dolly Parton, Outkast, Ludacris, Dale Earnhardt, all the way down to like
Brooks and Dunn.
I was gonna like Nashville Weatherman. There's actually a very specific reason all of our statues seem to honor slave-owning Confederates.
Most of the Confederate statues that you see today or that you saw up until a few years ago were not erected immediately after the Civil War. They were erected later as part of a very purposeful effort to recall the war in a certain light. The second period of renaming and erecting statues is the 1950s in response to the Civil Rights Movement.
Beyond that, they're just bad. I don't just mean insulting and painful, I also mean bad, just as statues. A lot of them were mass-produced and built on the cheap, which is why this video, which shows the statue of the boys who wore the gray toppling faster than a Jenga tower at a frat party, went viral. These statues might be easy to tear down, but at least they're also hard to look at, like this one of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Just look at him. It's like somebody asked a particularly untalented child to draw a nightmare murder cowboy.
It looks like they told the statue about like gay rights, and then he had that reaction and he got stuck that way.
Yeah. Also, it's funny to think that maybe like that's how far down the list of sculptors they had to go. Like every time they called a sculptor, like, okay, we need to commission a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, that there was like click, and then they got down to like, you know, Biloxi Community College sculpture program or whatever.
We wouldn't even sculpt
He's
it.
like, yeah, I'll do it. I mostly blow glass, but I think I can make a statue. That statue would make more sense if it was made by people who hated it. Actually, maybe we should leave that one up, because anyone looking at its first thought is, that guy must have sucked. And boy, did he suck.
Nathan Bedford Forrest was a Confederate general. He was a slave trader before the war. He oversaw at least one of the worst massacres of Black POWs during the war at Fort Pillow. You know, some people say he didn't know about it, but he let it happen even if he didn't give the order himself. And then after the war is instrumental in forming the Ku Klux Klan.
What the hell are we doing here, y'all? There are Southerners we could celebrate who weren't grand wizards of the Klan, you know. For example, we could still honor the 100,000 Southerners who fought in the Civil War on the winning side. Replace every Robert E. Lee statue with ones of Harriet Tubman, and not the old, sweet Underground Railroad grandma that we tell kids about. I mean the gun-toting, badass, stone-cold assassin Harriet Tubman, the one who was a brilliant spy for the U.S. Army and one of the brains behind the Combahee River Raid, which rescued more than 700 slaves. Every statue of Harriet should have two guns up and look like the cover of a graphic novel. Then we got Cassius Clay. No, not the boxer, but he was just as dangerous if you were a slave owner. He was a Southern emancipationist who freed his inherited slaves and paid them a wage in the 1840s. He also started an anti-slavery newspaper and fought a mob of about 60 people who came to destroy it. He also survived an assassination attempt where he was shot in the chest, then chased the guy down and cut off his nose with a Bowie knife. You're telling me he isn't cooler than this guy?
Taking down Confederate monuments is not erasing history. Where the erasure of history took place was when they were put up in the first place. The Lost Cause was a major disinformation campaign that caused large swaths of the country to kind of forget what the Civil War was actually about and to completely reinterpret it.
Gang, you'll forgive me.
No.
You ever wonder why Southern statues only celebrate racists?
Let me get out of here. All right. So I use that in courses and in PD because most of our babies are young white people who are going into teaching, and part of getting them into understanding how to vet curriculum is to help them formulate positive teacher identities that are not based on being anti something, but based on grounded experiences that they can be proud of, right? Having a white identity that is not anti-Black, but a white identity based in things that, you know, are historically accurate and something to pull from so they can have authentic relationships with kids of color. So examples like this, we have discussions about, right? And most of the times it's, we don't talk about it that way. We don't talk about being white that way. We don't, we're not, I don't feel like I have a culture is what I usually hear. And I tell them it's your birthright to have a culture. And just like my people have gained culture and rooted ourselves back into African and African American concepts, it's okay for you to be white and it's okay for you to have a positive white identity. And that's where the conversation starts so they can, like I said, have authentic relationships with kids of color. And then we talk about examples that center around African American Latinx kids. Like this was one of the examples that I was using today. Like a literacy language arts vetting opportunity would be picking a piece of literature or text assignment um, to facilitate literacy well enough to follow the guidelines of the CDC, or to avoid becoming prey to deceptive advertising for untested cures and preventions of viruses. Um, Asking the question, will it help empower African American and Latinx communities, which were affected most by COVID? Um, will it inform them and increase their protective mechanisms? So that's the kind of, these are the kinds of activities that we have to construct and create. So how to prepare our candidates really quick. I think I got 15 minutes. I've written about the 7 tenets of a healthy classroom. And at the time, I didn't have 7, but I put a couple of these things in that. I have a teaching NGSS in the era, teaching science in the era of NGSS. And part of this perspective was embedded in that writing. This is from my 14 years in the classroom. I teach this as the tenets of building a classroom community as opposed to classroom management. And like teacher know thyself is about what the video I just shared. It's about having a healthy identity um, so that you can then get to know your students and earn their trust. Kids will not learn from you if they don't trust you. And avoiding hypocrisy. I teach my candidates that if you make up a classroom rule, like you say you can't be on your cell phones in the class, that means you can't be on your cell phone either, right? Decrease the instances of microaggressions, judgments, and grudges by the teacher. I think, due to COVID, this is the first year that we hadn't had a mass shooting in a school. First year in like 19 years. It's crazy, right? I think a lot of times students feel alienated uh, because the teacher doesn't stop the bully. The teacher agrees with the bully, or the teacher doesn't feel like it's their responsibility to get involved in certain things between kids. Um, or they, like I said, they agree with the bully, or they think it's funny and you know, they do a whole, I've worked with a lot of teachers. Things like you could be talking to a student and a teacher come up and start talking to you as if you and the student didn't have a conversation going. And you got to stop the teacher and be like, you see, I'm having a conversation. And all that stuff stems from ageism and sexism and racism. And, but we teachers, we had, sometimes we have an ageism issue big time. So we have to work on that and we have to address those things. Um, know your epistemic practices and pedagogical content knowledge. Students have had a number of bad teachers who have to use the teacher's manual, and they're like, why should I take this seriously and value the information if you haven't even bothered to master it yourself, right? So kids pick up on that and they walk the halls talking about so-and-so's a good teacher, but so-and-so don't even know what she's talking about, right? So they have these conversations, and it's due to know your epistemic practices and pedagogical content knowledge is directly linked to the kids trusting you. Create physically and emotionally safe classrooms. Um, have very clear boundaries. Everybody can be who they are. I don't want to hear anybody talking about so and so's this or so and so like so and so, or you can't bag on anybody. You cannot clown. If any of that starts happening in this classroom, you don't want my wrath. And you make that very, very clear. And I call all of that the teacher putting themselves out there. Like, I'm fair and I'm generous, but I will treat you like I don't know you if you start picking on either one of your peers, and vice versa. So it's very important that they feel safe in that classroom and that they have each other's back. And then create classroom and academic routines that make sense to the student. So a lot of times teachers will create all kinds of nonsense because whatever, I don't know, and will um, unconsciously create conflict that could be avoided. You know, get to know your population of kids, find their rhythm. Don't make a classroom rule that you can't follow yourself, or enforcing that rule. Like, for instance, you cut up in class, you stay after 30 seconds or a minute, right? I ain't having you after class, after school. I gotta go someplace. So why am I torturing myself sitting here with you? We can work this out, right? Um, let's see. This is called teach them. What did I need to look at my slide. Culturally sanctioned interactions, right? Can I touch your hair? No. These are legitimately acquired knowledge bases that certain people have gained through a number of experiences. So um, either you've established authentic relationships with a particular group of people, you were brought up in the culture by being born or having membership in the group from a very young age. Uh, you have extensive close contact with the person or family in the cultural group. Maybe a godparent is a member of a cultural group, so you have an extensive time learning some cultural norms and ways of being, or you've been adopted into the culture as a child. So a very good girlfriend of mine who's Romanian and Hungarian asked me, um, why is it okay that Black people say the N word? And I said, that's a hard question because every, I'm not going to say everybody says the N word, but we know as African Americans that white folks say the N word too. I said that there are certain, she goes, is there ever an instance that a white person saying the N word is okay? And I said, the true answer to that is no, but we know that folks say it. So I said that there are instances where white folk have been socialized around African Americans and they've established either authentic relationships or they were adopted or they were brought up within the culture and they get to say it. I said the caveat is they can only say it around the people that brought them to the party. You can't leave your socially sanctioned group and think you could say it out on the street. That's the difference, right? So as an African American in a less formal environment, I'm socially sanctioned around African Americans because I'm a part of the membership group, right? The social membership. But I've been on the street and heard the N word and looked up and it was an Asian man. And I was like, and said it in the vernacular as if he had been brought up with Black people. And so I assumed, that's his culture. He's been socially sanctioned. Just nobody told him he couldn't just blurt it out in the middle of Venice Beach, right? So it's a very nuanced, crazy, historically contentious issue. But these are the kinds of things when we say that socially sanctioned interactions, if you understand how they're developed, you can avoid offending a cultural group, you can avoid appropriation and, looking like you're engaging in a culture that isn't yours per se. And so The way I did it with my Mexican American babies is that, I asked a lot of questions and had them help me with the language and learn the community, understanding that I'm going to be a participant in the community, but I needed to earn some of the social interactions from the parents and the kids. And that only went so far, but I understood that. Our candidates need to do that as well. Um, Using sensitivity and awareness to create emotionally and physically safe classrooms, making sure everyone's voice is respected and heard, using the pronouns that the students are comfortable with, and then socializing students so that every student feels safe is super important when it comes to anti-racist teaching practices. So this is kind of the social context of the classroom, hopefully of the school, that supports this kind of work as well. Teaching the children. Okay, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. Is there anything that you wanted to ask a question on from the other slides before I move on to planning and teaching as a cycle? Okay, so this is the planning process that I teach my candidates. I tell them you need to figure out the cultural, social, experimental context of the students. That means creating classroom profiles, getting to know the students, their talent, a strength, what they like about their culture, their funds of knowledge, that kind of thing. And then you want to create real world scenarios within the discipline for them to engage, have essential questions that relate to real life work and career in college, even at a little bitty age, even at a little bitty people. Um, Give them developmentally appropriate subject matter practices to engage in with lots of scaffolding depending on their literacy level and their experiences. I'd like to say kids over 9 learn quickly. I've had illiterate kids in my class who could be successful with the right amount of scaffolding. Learn multiple ways of supporting literacy. Definitely whole language works with African American students. Um, Whole language with pictures and how the word is used, uh, using multiple linguistic strategies works on all the kids. Having first language editions of textbooks. I always had Spanish textbooks around, and Spanish workbooks for my Spanish first language students and my emergent bilinguals. Then you plan your learning objectives. Well, actually, you should plan your assessments. And from your assessments and your epistemic practices, you do your learning objectives, and then you assess the kids, reflect on your work, and then you do the process all over again. Things to think about. So, when thinking about doing anti-racist teaching, make sure that you collect as much information about the students as possible, prior knowledge, funds of knowledge, experiences. Get good at asking different kinds of questions, conceptual, procedural, metacognitive, facilitated probing, clarifying questions so that you can direct the learning. We teach them how to do that. We teach them the differences between these kinds of questions and eliciting student responses. We make an emphasis on making the student's voice public, meaning you're organizing different responses in an area where all kids can see it so that students have access to your own metacognition. And then you make sure to plan illicit responses and provide a way for it to be public, what I just said. And so this is the teaching cycle. So the planning cycle is a lesson planning and getting the materials together. This is what you do with the kids in progress, right? So you give them time to think, you introduce a concept, you give them time to explore, you give them time to explain. This is the 5E lesson cycle here, with context for each part of the 5E. There are different kinds of lesson cycles or learning cycles. Because I'm of a science background, 5E is pretty popular and it's translatable to other subjects as well, but there's also other kinds of learning cycles. So introduce concrete ways of planning, concrete ways of engaging in the learning cycle. And we're teaching them about productive and non-productive responses. Productive responses are connections to their own knowledge, vocabulary, supporting each other, the students supporting each other, and addressing misconceptions and preconceptions. Non-productive responses from students lead to reinforcing gender, race, linguistic, socioeconomic deficits. We have to address those things. And so the students, the candidates get practice when, for instance, two Black kids get their math scores back. One of the Black kids gets a really high score. The other Black kid goes, "Oh, you must have some Asian in you because you did really good." You got to address that because that's a race stereotype. And so my response as a teacher would be, African Americans have been doing math for millennia. Like we built pyramids in the sand and we knew how to cultivate rice before everybody else did. So I think we're pretty good at math. That would be my cultural comeback, right? There's nothing wrong with Asian students being great at math, but it also implies that, they don't have access to the arts or aren't social or whatever. So there's these backlashes either way. You want to address those things, but you want to empower the kid who's got an internalized racism narrative going on. And then you want to address any narratives that reinforce status quo when it comes to the above categories. So, okay. So you interpret the kids' responses. You have different categories of interpretation. I think what's really important is how you plan on filling in the gaps that students have. And I break down possible gaps as conceptual, procedural, metacognitive, social, cultural, representational, or linguistic. So the candidates get practice, receive practice in addressing conceptual gaps. You want to use graphic organizers. You want to use Venn diagrams, whatever the conceptual issue is. Procedural, you want to do step by steps, heuristics. Metacognitive, you want to do think, pair, share, think alouds, working in groups with roles. Social, cultural, those are the analogies, examples, pulling from a kid's cultural, social experiences so that they can use the cognition that they usually solve problems with on a problem within the classroom. Representational, do they read it, see it, say it? It's a modal. Is it kinesthetic? And then, of course, linguistic. Are we using the strategies that strengthen the home language as well as build the academic language? And it is past 1:15. This is continuation of teaching.
Right. We always run out of time, right?
Always run out of time.
Never enough time.
Here's some points to ponder. The purpose. Okay.
So if you want to wrap it up with final comments, and then we can
Yeah.
head to our, okay, thank you.
Final comments, concerns, questions from the audience. I can talk all day.
Kathleen, how are we on questions? We've got some in here.
Only, yes, the session's being recorded. So that was a question. All of our sessions are being recorded. And I think that was it.
Yeah, I addressed the last one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the cameras are required in the district. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Linton. And
thank you.
As Janice told you earlier, we're hoping to have you back at a future event as well.
Because there was a lot in there. Like I could do 3 other workshops just on this stuff alone.
Right. But there is her evaluation. You can either click on the link or if you have a QR scanner on your app on your phone, you can scan it. And then if I can encourage everybody to come back to the main room now for not our main room, our other sessions.
There's Zoom linkies for those as well. They're in the agendas, right? The agenda.
Yes.
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 Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
the next session is at 1:20 in 2 minutes. That's our closing speaker with Dr. Zavala. So you could, the
Yes,
Zoom
I
link is
cannot
there.
wait.
Yes. And you're friends with him, right? You know him?
I
Awesome.
just saw her last night via Zoom.
Awesome. All
Thank
right.
you
Well, I
very
look forward to
much.
seeing everybody in Dr.
Thank you.
Zavala's presentation. Thank you, Dr. Linton.
Thank you.